Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is the Banner Saga 2? I'm a little late on this one, gotta be honest. There hasn't been an awful lot coming out over the course of January, and there's some stuff on the way for February, but as you're probably aware, I headed off on the metal cruise that I go on every year, 70,000 tons of metal, and it's 4 wonderful days without internet. So usually I take a game along with me to play during my downtime. Last year I think it was Punch Club, a bit of a waste of time unfortunately. This year I thought, hey, I'll bring along Banner Saga 2, because I've been meaning to get around to playing it, and I was reminded about it recently since they announced the Kickstarter for Banner Saga 3, which was an odd decision, at least on the surface anyway, because Banner Saga 2 was funded in the traditional way. It was not crowdfunded at all. What was interesting about that is that they made a pretty convincing argument that part of the benefit of kickstarting a video game is the exposure that you get and the marketing and the hype that starts to build up behind it. By they, of course, I mean Stoic Entertainment, the folks behind the original Banner Saga, which, full disclosure, I did back on Kickstarter back in the day for about $25, one of the first games that I kickstarted, and I certainly did not regret doing so. I enjoyed that game an awful lot, although it had something of an abrupt ending. That said, the game was designed to be a trilogy. It was always intended to be a trilogy, and as Banner Saga 2 came along, it became abundantly clear as to why that ending was so abrupt and why there was such a cliffhanger. Warning, if you are watching this video and have not played the original Banner Saga, inherent to quite a bit of what you might see here would be spoilers of the original game. That's essentially unavoidable, since there are some pretty key consequences to decisions, and a very big decision that you make in the first game that directly affects what happens in the second. If you haven't played the original, it's best to play that before playing this one, since you can import a saved game from the original Banner Saga to the Banner Saga 2, and decisions that you made, consequences, and of course the state of your characters and items will be carried over. This is a very good thing indeed, and it's great when games incorporate that, particularly when you're going to deliberately build a story-driven trilogy around certain characters, and this is especially true since those characters have no guarantee of reaching the end. Now, before we have a look at this and explain the differences between this and the first Banner Saga game, it will not take long to look at the options menu, because there barely is one. It's a little odd, and kinda silly, frankly. It doesn't have proper resolution options. In order to get the resolution that you want, you will have to manually set your monitor to that resolution. For capturing, I want to capture at 1080p. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that, because there was no option to set it to such. It decided to take whatever my native resolution was, so I had to manually put my monitor on a 1080p setting, sorry, in order to get that. That's a pain in the ass, and windowed mode puts it in 4:3 aspect ratio, which is really weird, and it shouldn't do that. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, and frankly, it's quite silly that this is still an issue in the game and hasn't been fixed since its release, so I'm not particularly impressed by that. Also, a lack of sound sliders. Come on, really? This is basic stuff. Toggles are not enough. You have sliders, so people can change this sort of thing. I understand why there's a lack of graphics options, because as you're maybe aware, the Banner Saga uses a rather unique rotoscoped aesthetic, and honestly, turning up or down the detail probably wouldn't make a great deal of sense there. So I can get that, but otherwise, lack of options here, not so good, and I'm sure they could have added a couple more useful pieces of information into the UI as well when it came to visual feedback to the user and making sure they have all the data at hand to make a proper decision. Those are all lacking. They were lacking in the mobile version as well, although the PC version is superior thanks to more accurate controls, and higher resolution allows for you to see more of the battlefield at any given time. This is particularly important when you enable the stats flag options above the heads of the characters in the battlefield. It gets a little busy, let's just say, on a small screen, so I would recommend playing it on a larger one. So what is Banner Saga? If you're not familiar with it, it is essentially a very grim Oregon Trail with tactical battles set in a fictional Norse world. You lead a group, and they are under your rather flashy, large red banner, and you are attempting to travel across the world to escape an impending apocalypse. It's a pretty damn grim world. You are battling for survival, and the game consists of 3 major components. This is the first one. You will, every now and again, have the opportunity to rest at camp. You can set camp pretty much any time, and that gives you access to rest, which means that you can recover from injuries. These injuries are usually sustained in battle, and if you continue to fight with a character that is injured, they will be less effective. If you wish to spend the time, they can rest and recover. Problem is, spending time uses up supplies, because as you can see at the top right here, you are trying to manage a tribe of people. I have almost 600 clansmen and fighters in Val that I'm trying to protect. So they're going to consume supplies. If you decide to hang around too often, yeah, you can get a morale boost for resting and giving people time to recuperate and calm down, but it's going to eat up supplies, and if you run out of supplies, well, people are going to start dying off and your morale will fall. So there is a pretty hefty resource management aspect to the game, which is why I mentioned Oregon Trail, but more recent examples, perhaps like FTL, Death Road to Canada, and so on and so forth, also fall quite nicely into this category. This idea of resource management and survival through a difficult journey. In this camp, you're also able to access the marketplace. This will allow you to buy supplies. This only happens when you reach specific towns and villages on the map. You don't get this all the time. That's quite important because there are only limited times where you can buy supplies and even fewer ways perhaps to acquire them. So you've got to be careful there. But instead of buying supplies, you could buy items. The single currency in the game, it's called Renown. Renown is acquired through battle. It's also acquired through making good decisions. If your name grows, and if you do things that impress people, you'll gain renown. That renown lets you get items and supplies. So there's a keen balance to be struck as to where you spend your limited renown. Do you want to get items for your characters to make them more powerful in battle, or do you want to get supplies? And renown is also spent in leveling up heroes. This is quite important. And we'll get to that in a minute. We don't have access to the hero camp as of yet. As you'll notice, this is a story-driven part of the camp. Every now and again when you camp, you'll probably be given some sort of decision and have a conversation with certain members of your tribe, the heroes, for the most part. And this is where a lot of the choice consequence kicks in. What I was surprised by in both the original Banner Saga and this one is that this is not a game about the illusion of choice. There are plenty of narratively driven games that give you that illusion of choice. They say, hey, yeah, you can role-play a character, you can make a choice, and that will actually affect the game. Sometimes that's not true. Telltale games have got a little bit of a reputation these days for that, in the sense that the decisions that you make don't necessarily have all that much of an impact. And honestly, that's a problem a lot of video games have. They generally start off narrow, they widen in the middle, but then they must all culminate. They have to tie those threads together towards the end, so a lot of choices are generally inconsequential. That said, I think the Banner Saga is one of the few games where choices definitely matter. Not all of these characters may make it to the end if you make the wrong choices. There are some pretty drastic turns of events that affect not only the battles that you gain access to, but also key story elements, which characters join you, which characters don't join you, and all that sort of thing. And I found that to be very satisfying indeed. Reminded me of some of the things that happened in a much older game by the name of Shining Force 3. There's a couple of other games that have done this, where they've designed trilogies and had these real consequences and such. I mean, hell, great example, the Mass Effect trilogy. There are certain situations where not every character's going to get to the end, and they may very well be replaced by another one, and all that sort of thing. This game has the same going on with it, but since it's perhaps more focused and less complicated than something like Mass Effect, it's a little easier, perhaps, to create real choice and consequence, especially when a lot of the consequences are very much numeric. Just mostly skipping through this here, if you want to read it, feel free to pause as we go, but we're not going to sit on the text-based conversations for too long, since I'd like to show you a little bit of the battles and all that sort of thing, so I'm mostly just randomly picking options. But the choices that I choose here will certainly have an impact. Occasionally, there's going to be no way out of a situation, but more often than not, there is, and sometimes you'll gain rewards, such as extra renown. Of course, other times you will be penalized for a bad decision, and a lot of that is represented through the numbers up here. If you make a bad decision, it might cause some clansmen to die and all that sort of thing. And that does have an effect on the game. The smaller tribe you have, the less supplies you're going to need, but there are penalties for doing so. Not to mention the fact that, honestly, if you're invested in your role as the leader of this clan, you don't want people to die. There are moments that are genuinely emotionally draining, certainly, but I actually found myself getting kind of upset when I saw these numbers going down. Even though you don't know the people specifically, even though they're not characters you've interacted with, you feel guilty, especially losing the Varl, by the way. And you'll know why if you have played the original Banner Saga. Let's just say there aren't that many of them, so maybe don't get them killed. Alright, time to leave the camp. And again, we're just going to skip through all of this. So this is the second component of the game, the travel sequences. You'll see the days tick along here. You get these absolutely gorgeous vistas to look at. The first game had plenty of those. This one does as well. That iconic red banner, certainly more iconic than that damn hat and Watch Dogs, I'll tell you that for a fact. Waving in the breeze, and a wonderful soundtrack by Austin Wintory, who I nominated in the soundtrack category of the Arbitrary Awards 2016 for a damn good reason. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, you gotta be a little bit careful with some of these choices here. You will get reactions from characters. You may earn things which are actually tangible, renown, items, and so on and so forth, or receive tangible penalties, or maybe you just end up upsetting a character. That is part of the role-playing aspect of the game. And what I will say about the role-playing aspect is that the characters that you end up playing, and very minor spoiler, we might even get to that in this video. I warned you about potential spoilers anyway. This is at the very start of the game, so I'm minimizing it as much as I can, but ultimately, you're going to run into those issues in a story-driven game like that, as you see the gameplay. You get a lot more choice in the characters that you get to play. In fact, there are two groups in this game that you can alternate between. You don't get a choice in whether or not you alternate, but you will do so, and that's great because you get an entirely separate roster of heroes, and those heroes have different abilities, and that usually means that the combat tactics that you use and the style of the battles play out very differently. This very much helps add significant variety to the game, because that third component that I was mentioning is the tactical battle system, and we will most likely run into one of those very shortly indeed. But here we get a nice little feature. They have done a great deal of work fleshing out the lore of this world. You have this entire map, and you can click on almost anything. If it's got a name, chances are you can click on it and find out about it. And that is fantastic. I mean, not only does this look absolutely gorgeous, but if you are the sort of person that likes to immerse themselves in the lore of a world, then you have an awful lot of that available here, and for the most part, it is completely optional. Nice to have that. Alright, and on we go. You won't be choosing exactly where to go in this game. The map is, for the most part, just giving you context and story elements and lore. But it's nice that it's there, and I've got to appreciate that. Now, I did mention the aspect of heroes, and we're going to be able to mess around with that momentarily, and that allows me to talk a little bit about one of the improvements that have been made in this sequel, because it is a sequel, despite being part of a trilogy. There's something of a argument that Banner Saga 2 is too similar to the original. But actually, there's quite a lot of improvements that have been overlooked by some people. Maybe they just don't know enough about it. Maybe they just forgot. And honestly, I kind of did as well, really. I forgot about some of the aspects of the original, so I went and checked up. And let me demonstrate what I'm talking about right here. So, you are able to promote heroes by using renown. I don't have enough to promote my main guy here. It's going to cost 13 renown, and unfortunately I only have 9 at the moment. You'll see his ability available here, and those abilities have various ranks. Those ranks are usually dependent on how much willpower you use in a battle, but we'll explain a little bit more of that once we actually find a battle. Each of these characters has a passive ability, and there's a wide variety of classes, a much larger variety of classes this time around. However, there are some changes in the way that characters progress. In the original game, there wasn't a great deal of character progression when it comes to stats. As you leveled up, you were able to increase stats, and that was really about it. And here are the stats right there. It would be nice if this had hover over tooltips. I really don't see why it doesn't, but all of these things do have different effects. Strength, for instance, is both damage and health. It might sound a little bit weird to someone who hasn't played the Banner Saga, but I'll explain it once we get into a battle. However, this time around, they have implemented a system whereby once you max out a stat, you can get up to 3 ranks of one of 2 mutually exclusive talents. So if I max out my strength, I will be able to then spend additional points either in Robust, which is a chance to resist strength damage, or Artery Strike, bonus crit chance. This gives you additional customization options, and it made sense that they would put something like this in the game, considering that in the previous title, it looked like you were going to max out those stats pretty damn quickly. And yeah, you're right, you absolutely would have. The interesting thing about this is also that once you hit, I think, rank 5 or 6, you're able to choose a second ability. So that vastly increases the number of tactical options you have versus the first game. And it lets you sometimes choose from a wider variety of stuff. In the case of Oddleaf, and this is something I remember from my playthrough on mobile, this is why I'm playing from the start, by the way. I've finished the whole thing on mobile, but unfortunately, of course, there's no cross-save capability for that. Oddleaf can choose between I believe it's a sort of like an Eagle Strike or something like that, which is a really long-range attack, or the ability to fire an explosive arrow, which will cause the ground to burn in a certain area. And this allows you to diversify her in terms of what her class is able to do. Some of the classes have up to 4 different abilities that you can choose from, so you have greater customization available than you otherwise would have. Mogan's a great example of that, for instance. I believe he starts as a Thrasher with Bloody Flail, but if I recall correctly anyway, you can choose from other abilities later on to make him a little bit more of a tank or something along those lines. These are all welcome additions because the character progression and the stats meddling that you got to do in the original game was fairly light. It was pretty simplistic. Just like the first game, you can also equip items, although this time around the items are certainly more powerful because they all have level limits, so you can go, I think, up to level 10 items, although it's entirely possible that your characters won't even reach level 10 through a playthrough. None of mine did. I think one of them could have, but I couldn't afford the renown to do it, because as I mentioned, renown is a very limited resource, and you have to watch out when it comes to managing it, choosing between leveling up characters, paying for supplies, or buying new items. So I appreciate that they've fleshed this whole aspect out. And this is important for those of us that very much enjoyed the tactics element of Banner Saga 2. If you enjoyed the tactics element, by the way, Banner Saga 2 also includes a survival mode, which is a set of 40 tactical battle challenges that you can use your existing characters in. So even if you have beaten the story and you're not interested in playing it again to maybe see a few different choices and consequences, you still have a lot of extra content. And that was what the original game was criticized for to some extent. It was a weird situation with Banner Saga because it was supposed to have a multiplayer component. What ended up actually happening is the multiplayer component was released prior to Banner Saga as a free-to-play game called Banner Saga Factions. I think it was called Factions, something along those lines. And it was not bad. It was pretty interesting. I wasn't entirely convinced by the business model or anything like that. I believe that game is now defunct, but it wasn't part of the package, which meant that people's perception of the game as a value proposition went down, even though technically the multiplayer mode always existed, but it was standalone. So people had some doubts as to whether or not the game was worthy of purchase, considering it was a pretty linear, story-driven game, and maybe didn't warrant a second playthrough. Although, honestly, I really do think that it does, because of the amount of choice and consequence going on. And genuine choice and consequence as well. Alright, well, we're out of the camp. And I'm going to hopefully be able to choose something that involves a battle of some description. But at the moment, we are starting to deal with, let's just say, a few schisms in our camp. You are going to be dealing with a lot of crises. If you thought the original was stressful, this one even more so. There are so many decisions. Everything is falling, it's just falling down around your ears. It's not a nice experience. And I love that. I love that level of tension. Some of you might not, because there are some really hard choices to make here, and a lot of consequence, and this game definitely likes to play the shades of grey card. There are not many right or wrong answers. And what I really like is that there aren't too many binary choices. A lot of them have 3, 4, maybe even 5 options that are maybe degrees of success or degrees of failure. And that's great. I think after playing an awful lot of BioWare games, I've come to get a little tired of the binary morality choices. This game has no morality meter, and more often than not, the decisions that you make may seem like there is absolutely no right answer, because sometimes there isn't. That said, a lot of the decisions that you do make are very logical, and if you properly roleplay the leader character, and as I mentioned, there are 2 parties in this game. I haven't got to that yet, but it happens a little bit later on, quite early on anyway in the game. If you roleplay the characters in the way that they are supposed to be, if you paid attention to their personalities, you generally will get a good result. All right, looks like we're getting into a battle, so I'm going to show you the final component of the game right here. I can choose from my roster as to who I wish to send in. And we are going to mix it up. You can send it up to 6, and you also, of course, set your turn order. This is fairly important because the battle system is very reliant on turn order. We'll send a couple of the Varl in, and if you click on them, you can tell exactly what they do. Again, this is the kind of thing that could have been done with hover over, and it almost makes me think that it hasn't been because they were looking for a simultaneous mobile release as well. I don't think the game suffers a great deal from also being on mobile. However, things like hover over tooltips and information that can be displayed through the UI thanks to the higher resolution and widescreen options that are available for PC users is absent, and I don't really appreciate that. It would be good if Banner Saga 3 properly incorporated these options for PC users. I have very little doubt that the majority of players are on PC for this title. Alright, let's jump into battle. If you've seen the original Banner Saga, you're probably going to be very familiar with this. However, there are a couple of little changes. I did mention earlier the significant number of additional classes and skills. That in itself is a great change. But what they've also done is, rather than having empty battlefields, there are now far more obstacles in your way. There might be destructible obstacles such as barricades. There may very well be hazards. There's quite a few of those on the battlefield, and some units can even create them. This is a good addition because, as you can probably notice, these Varl characters, who look pretty damn strong, right? And they are, also take up 4 tiles rather than 1. This means that by including more obstacles and impediments on the terrain, the tactical aspect of positioning is enhanced. Instead of having just an open battlefield, which is what Banner Saga 1 for the most part had, almost every battlefield in Banner Saga 2 has some sort of obstacle, and as a result, you can really screw up, especially if you have a Varl-heavy party. You do not want to move them to the wrong place, and paying attention to turn order is absolutely key. This is the turn order down the bottom, and what happens is, my side gets to move, their side gets to move. This keeps happening until one side is reduced down to a single person, at which point, pillage mode is enabled. Pillage mode is designed so that you can finish off a battle quickly, and it would be a little bit ridiculous if every time you took an action, the last remaining opponent was able to take an action, because, frankly, if there's 6 of you left and only 1 opponent, there's no way in a million years that opponent should be slaughtering half your army. That can be a particular problem as well if you're dealing with a boss. If you were dealing with a boss and pillage mode didn't exist, you probably wouldn't be able to win. So I'm kind of glad that that's there. There is quite a lot of turn order manipulation in this game as well. So there are various abilities you can use to either force a enemy character back in the turn order, so you can cause them to take less actions, or put one of your characters further forward in the turn order, so they can take an action perhaps key to the strategy prior to the opponent. On the harder difficulties in particular, that turn order manipulation is very important, and it adds a lovely little element of depth. So, as you can see, I can move around and stand in these tiles. The yellow tiles require willpower, which is a resource. It's the yellow resource. I'll turn on the flags just to show you everyone's willpower and everything like that. There are 3 stats you really need to worry about here. Willpower at the top in yellow, armor that mitigates damage, and the red icon here is strength. Now, Banner Saga 1 also had this aspect, and it was a little bit weird, and some people complained about it, and I can sort of understand why they did. Strength is also hit points. So, what happens is, if you take strength damage, obviously you're losing hit points, but you're also losing attack damage. Some people are quite confused by that and think that's a bit of a bad design decision. And the reason they believe that is because it can cause characters to become almost useless later on in the battle if they've taken damage. Now, I think that in Banner Saga 1, that was probably a more valid criticism than it is in Banner Saga 2, because they've addressed quite a lot of that through adding those additional abilities. And most of those abilities are not necessarily reliant on strength. That means that by having a wider variety of classes with a wider variety of abilities, you can mitigate that feeling of uselessness that a low-strength character has after he's taken a few hits. Now, strength does not affect your ability to break armor. That's the other stat I was talking about. You can see this guy has a lot of armor here. Now, the formula is fairly simple. You take your strength, you subtract the enemy armor, and that's the amount of damage you're able to do. If an enemy has low armor, your strength damage is going to be very severe. However, if the enemy has higher armor than you have strength, you know, this is a great example. This character right here has 12 strength. This dude over here has 16 armor. I'll be able to maybe do 1 damage, but I'll have a chance for it to be deflected entirely. I'm gonna move him over there. And then the turn. So, for these tougher characters, you often have to try and reduce the armor of the opponent. Now, you'll see here if I move, it's going to show how much strength damage I could do. This is also a range indicator, by the way. So, as you move around, it will tell you who you can hit. So, if I use 1 willpower, I'll be able to move up a little bit closer. And I can either use my ability here, which is Tempest, which is a area of effect. No use here, since I'm dealing with just one guy. Or alternatively, I can attack him. And that's my attack range. I click on him, and it's going to say, alright, I can hit him for 1. I have a strength of 16, but he also has 16 armor. Alternatively, I can try and break his armor. And I can invest willpower to do a little bit more damage. So if I hit him like that, I'm going to do 2 armor damage. Now that means that future hits against him are going to do more and more. So deciding whether or not to do strength damage or armor damage is a key component of the strategy of the game. Positioning, of course, is very important too. Certain characters are able to provide defensive buffs and act as tanks, and all sorts of things like that. The Varl in particular are good at that since they take up a lot of space on the board. But yeah, this is how the battle system works. If you play the original, you are probably very familiar with it, but it's just more fleshed out. It is generally better overall. I would say that it's not perfect in terms of the amount of information that you are given. Special abilities, for some reason, don't seem to have an awful lot of visual feedback as to how much damage they're going to do. You have to calculate that for yourself. Rain of Arrows, great example right here. So I placed this trap earlier. Just ignore that it makes absolutely no sense for arrows to hover in the air for several minutes at a time. Just ignore that. It's magic. Woo, wizards. I would like to know exactly how much damage is going to be done here from this trap. Now, I can if I calculate it myself. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, it says 1 time strength damage, 2 times strength damage. But it would be nice to have a visual indicator. With a trap, it's less of a big deal because I don't even know what strength value I'm going to have by the time this trap actually triggers. Not a clue. But I'll place it anyway. But for more direct abilities like Tempest, I want to know exactly how much damage that is going to do before I take part in it. It's, again, a minor nitpick, but with tactics games, I am always on the side of information transparency, and obfuscating that information is unhelpful, even if it wasn't done deliberately. Outside of that, though, I find the tactics element very satisfying. Just like the first game, but since you have more class variety and you get to play 2 parties instead of 1, you get to mess around with a lot of different tactics and unit types, and you even get the introduction later on in the game, and this is part of the feature set, so it's not really a spoiler, of Horseborn characters, who are centaurs, which is great, because they act in completely different ways as well. I love the combat animations as well. You've probably been struck by the aesthetic of Banner Saga. Banner Saga 2 is no exception. It doesn't seem like they cut many corners here. That rotoscoped animation has a very eerie feel to it. Almost Uncanny Valley, I suppose, if you could really call it that. It looks weirdly realistic. Very few games use this technique, so it's nice to see that. And as I said, personally, I absolutely adore it myself. There we go. Oh, hang on a bit. Arc lightning. There we go. Lovely. And zap. Overall, I think that this is a fantastic addition to the trilogy. And it gives me a lot of hope for the third game. That's currently on Kickstarter at the moment. I will most likely be backing it, since I've enjoyed the first two, and I certainly want to see the conclusion, and I feel that Stoic, for the most part, can be trusted to provide the experience that they promised. The story of Banner Saga 2, for me, was extremely engaging. It was emotionally provocative, and the amount of choice consequence gave me a very satisfying feel, and also kept me on edge. That's the best thing about choice consequence in games, in my opinion. If it keeps you on edge and keeps you stressed out and tense, that's the sort of experience that I personally really enjoy. If you're the sort of person that really does not like that stressful aspect, well, Banner Saga is by no means a happy-go-lucky game, and you may very well dislike it as a direct result of that. For me, though, it's exactly the sort of thing that I enjoy. The story mode, I think, took me probably about 10 hours or so to beat, and as I mentioned earlier, there is that survival mode as well, to give you a lot more of the tactical battles, if you so desire. Plus, it does have replay value. There are a couple of different difficulty levels. If you wish to play it on higher difficulty, you certainly can do that, if you so desire. Pretty much entirely up to you in that regard. I don't think I'm going to be doing much damage with this, but hey. There is also the addition of various training challenges, which are these little awkward puzzle scenarios that you can do in the camp, and they will allow you to gain a bunch of extra renown, and I would strongly recommend that you do that. There are also some hidden achievement challenges in the game, which will give you extra renown as well, and they're usually related to doing specific actions with specific characters. So that's pretty neat as well. Overall, I think this is a really satisfying experience. It's a shame it took me this long to get to it. I did mean to play it, honest. I really, really did mean to. I think after seeing a couple of fairly poor tactics games lately, it was great to go back to a game that understands that genre well, and is able to do tactics in a fairly unique fashion, and also tie in a really great choice consequence story. It's an awesome amalgamation of what's basically a choose-your-own-adventure, alongside a really solid tactics engine and great storytelling, and now improved character progression and customization as well. I would strongly recommend it. I would strongly recommend that you play the first one before you play this. You will find this one more satisfying if you do. You'll get a lot more context, then of course you can import your characters and continue where you left off, and then get ready potentially for Banner Saga 3. It's great. It's absolutely fantastic, and unbelievably beautiful. God, it's just so damn gorgeous. Not to mention the soundtrack is incredible. Anyway, I could wax lyrical all day about that particular aspect of it. I think in terms of the aesthetic, you may very well either love it or hate it. Some people really don't like the rotoscoped style. I personally think it's phenomenal. But Banner Saga 2 is currently available on mobile devices as well as Steam for $20 or your regional equivalent. There's also a pack that includes Banner Saga 1 and 2 if you wish to play through the whole lot. And I do believe they pop up on the Humble Bundle every once in a while, so it's often worth paying attention to that to see if you can pick it up at a unreasonably cheap price. My name's been TotalBiscuit, taking a look at Banner Saga 2. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there, and maybe over the next few days we'll be doing a little bit more catch-up on some titles that I certainly should have covered before the flood of stuff in February comes our way. I'll see you next time.